First of all, welcome to the University of Adelaide, the Waite campus. My name's Alan Gamlin. I'm the director of something called the Hugo Centre for Migration and Population Research at the University of Adelaide. We're based in the Napier Building in the North Terrace campus. We were delighted to be approached by ABS to co-host this event. No doubt that invitation partly stemmed from the long and productive relationship that the ABS has built over a period of many decades with our founding director, the late Professor Graham Hugo, whose work with the Australian Census has been influential not just on academic research, particularly around international migration, but also on a wide range of national and international policy issues surrounding demographic change. So we're delighted to be here as part of a continuation of that long-term relationship. Arguably, Australia has one of the best housing and population censuses in the world. In terms of frequency and content, it provides a rich source of data for research on population trends and how people and housing are distributed across place and time. It's a critical source of data we use at the Hugo Centre, of course. A vast majority of our research and consultancy projects leverage the value that exists within or can be derived from the census in its own right, or as an added data set to complement various primary and other secondary data sets. As a migration researcher myself, the Australian Census offers a valuable set of insights into understanding how overseas communities settle in Australia, what their experiences are like, and what their contributions are to the Australian population. The digital and the spatial elements of the census offer us the ability to explore relationships that exist between people and place, which can inform decision-making and add value to policy and planning processes, often resulting in research findings not easily identifiable from more traditional statistical approaches. The Hugo Centre also contributes to the ABS spatial geography through the provision of the Accessibility/Remoteness Index of Australia, ARIA Plus it's called, which is used by the ABS to provide population statistics in one of 5 remoteness area categories. And we value this partnership, which has been ongoing for over 15 years now. So we're delighted to be co-hosting this seminar, and we welcome you all to this campus of the University of Adelaide, and particularly we welcome Sue and Valise, who I'll hand over to now.
Okay, welcome everybody. We've been doing a grand tour around the country over the past 6 or 7 weeks now, trying to get out to as many capital cities and region areas of Australia to present some of the key headlines from the census and provide a bit of tailored data too about the area in which we're speaking. So it's a great pleasure that we find ourselves in Adelaide, and I'd like to thank you very much for turning on some Canberra weather for us so we don't feel too homesick. So fabulous. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, who are the traditional custodians in the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today or listening to the live streaming. All right, so a bit of background just before we get into the census. The census is one of those things that is used by the ABS and others in very, very many ways. It underpins a lot of the, democratic processes that exist within the country. It underpins a lot of the surveys that actually we run within the ABS. It forms the basis on which billions of government dollars are dispersed amongst the country. And in recent years, it's actually had an additional life, as it were, by forming new bases of statistics, by being linked to other data sets to provide new insightful data sets that researchers can access to try and solve sort of wicked policy problems as well. So the value of the census, it costs us a lot of money to run every 5 years, but there is a lot of benefit that is derived across the country by having this 5-yearly stock take of Australia's population and housing. So what have we been doing in the year or so since Census Night? Well, we've been doing a lot of work on transforming all the bits of information that people supplied on their online forms or on their paper forms, and we've been transforming that into information. Now, a lot of our forms, nearly 2/3 came in online, but that still meant we had a lot of paper forms. And may surprise you to know that not everybody writes neatly within boxes on paper forms. So one of the things you have to do, first of all, is to try and decipher some of it, And I'll put my hand up too. I'm not very good at writing in boxes, so thank God for the online is what I say. So we received just over nearly 8.5 million household forms, and we received about 750,000 personal forms, and two-thirds of that total almost was online. We have to employ, on a short-term basis, a lot of additional staff to come and help us code the responses from people and to process the data. A lot of our processing systems work automatically, but we also have quite a lot of manual clerical interventions. So we had 5.3 billion transactions on the data set as it worked through our processing system, and we had about almost 23 million manual clerical transactions. That's people going in, having a look at coding, see where it needs to change to fit within a particular classification. We've got derivations to do, etc., etc. So we've produced an enormous data set, and a lot of that data set was released on June the 27th this year. In October, there'll be a second release, which is when our labour force information comes out from the census, and will provide us with information on occupation and industry, employment data, and where people lived a year ago and 5 years ago, so internal migration information, which is really important as well. On the day of release, within our pre-filled products, we estimate that we've constructed about 2.8 million tables of data, and then we've also got a product which allows people to go in and create their own tables as well. So it's just a huge data set that we've got, and we'll share with you today some of what that data tells us. So how did we go with our 2016 census? Was it successful? Is it good quality? Well, these are 3 of the quality indicators that we produce after each census to give you a sense of how each census has performed. And so our top rate there is that 95.1% is the overall response rate from our private dwellings. And that's our top headline indicator of all the quality indicators. And that's certainly within the range of the last 2 censuses. Anything between 95 and 96 is what we anticipate for a good quality Australian census, and is very comparable to our international peers as well. Our online response rate, well, our target was 65%. We actually got 63.3. No doubt with our Census Night issues, that's taken a little bit off what we might have achieved. But 63.3% is a really good outcome. and it's got a really good outcome for data quality as well. What we find is that data quality on an online form tends to be better than on a paper form, not only because the typing is generally better than the writing and easier to comprehend, but we also find that people tend to answer all of the questions as they go through the online form. It's quite easy to miss a question at the bottom of quite a busy paper form. We also had some what we call targeted supplementary questions on the online form attached to the questions about industry and occupation. Now, what that means is that we tried to have some additional questions to extract a bit more detail from respondents. If they replied, for example, that they were a teacher, well, we'd like to know what kind of teacher they are. Are you a childcare teacher? Are you, preschool teacher, primary, high school, etc.? And so for a range of occupations, when people just gave us a very short description, we had prompts to try and get more information from them. So we're confident that we would have more detailed information this time than we've had previously. The other thing about the online census as well is that it leads people through the questions that are relevant to them. So if you're retired, for example, once you've done your initial screening question that calculates you haven't worked in the previous 2 weeks, it then that's a halt to your questionnaire. You don't then have to go through and start figuring out whether the labour force employment questions relate to you, because very clearly they don't. That screening questions establish that. So for people who aren't working, the online form actually takes very little time to fill in because those questions aren't relevant for you. So in many ways it's a lot less confusing. So the last measure there is something called net undercount. How do we work out net undercount? Well, after every census, we run something called a post-enumeration survey. And this goes out into the field several weeks after the census, and it tries to establish how many people we've missed, who we should have counted, and then how many people we've counted more than once. And unbelievably, some people do try and respond as many times as possible, particularly if they've got 1 or 2 houses and they think they have to respond on behalf of each of the houses. So the outcome of that is, with the missing people and the people who are counted more than once, we come up with a measure which traditionally in Australia is a net undercount. And in 2016 it was 1%, and that compares to 1.7% in 2011. So in terms of net undercount, that's a better result. We did have some fairly large-scale gross moves underneath that, but the net undercount is looking good. The last thing I'll say on data quality before we actually move on to the data is that for the first time ever, we actually had an independent census quality assurance panel formed after the 2016 census. And this was formed by the statistician to deal with the perception about any potential quality issues arising after census night. And so we had 6 people on this panel. It was headed up by Sandra Harding, who's the Vice-Chancellor of James Cook Uni. And I'll need you to log in, I think, Valise, while I'm talking about that. Oh, no, it's come back. Excellent. Included one of Australia's top demographers, Peter MacDonald. It included a Canadian census expert who'd run the 2011 Canadian census, and a number of other academics. They released a report of the independent panel on the date of the census release on June the 27th, and they gave us the seal of approval and said that people should use the data with confidence. So along with that and these quality measures, we're very happy with the quality of the 2016 census. So enough about process and background. What I'll do now is to take you through some of the key stories, the key data stories. A lot of these are at the Australia level, but where possible we've tried to give the Adelaide perspective as well. And I think it's fascinating. It just shows you how Australia is changing over time, and also how Adelaide is as well. So this map here shows you that when we refer into the presentation to Adelaide, it's in this case the Greater Adelaide Capital City Statistical Area. Now, you can type Adelaide into any of our products and you come up with a lot of different geographies. There's lots of different ways of looking at Adelaide, but this larger area is the one we'll be looking at today. So, how have we gone in terms of population growth? Well, in 2016, we counted 23.4 million Australians who were usual residents were counted on census night. In addition to that 23.4 million, we also counted 300,000 overseas visitors. And who we didn't count were the 600,000 Australians who were holidaying overseas. So the 23.4 million are usual residents counted on census night. This is a doubling of the population in the last 50 years and is growth of about 8.8% over the 5 years since 2011. Okay. So where do Australians live? Well, New South Wales is still our most populous state, with almost 7.5 million people, usual residents, counted in New South Wales on census night. Closely followed by Victoria, 5.9 million, and South Australia there has almost 1.7 million. The interesting thing, though, is how our population is clustered along the eastern mainland states. And so 80% of Australia's population lives in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and the ACT. So it's heavily weighted to that side of the country. In terms of growth rates, you'll see that a lot of the states and territories have grown at quite different rates over the past 5 years. And so if you have a look at the ACT, that's one of our fastest growing states and territories at 11.2%. WA is also up there at 10.5%. And Victoria's up there at 10.7. So those are three fastest growing areas. South Australia's grown by 5% over that 5 years, and Tasmania is sort of bringing up the rear there at 3% growth over a 5-year period. This shows the growth of the capital cities. What we see in the census is that the population growth in the capital cities is almost twice of that in the balance of state. So population of the capital cities is growing about 10.7% over that 5 years, and it's something like 5.6% for the balance of state. So our fastest growing capital city between 2011 and 16 is actually Darwin, and that grew by 13.5%. Followed by Perth, 12.4%, and then by Melbourne at 12.6%. So they're growing pretty quickly, those three capital cities there. Adelaide, over the same period, grew by 5.8%, and Hobart by 5.1%. This next slide here illustrates the population growth of Melbourne and Sydney, and it's showing you there that Melbourne over the past 2 censuses is really catching up in terms of population compared with Sydney. Now, Melbourne's population is being added to by 1,850 people a week on those growth figures, whereas for Sydney it's 1,650. So our projections which are a few years out of date, I think, show Melbourne catching up to Sydney by about 2030 or 35. So one of the things that the census allows us to do in our 5-yearly stock take is just have a look not only how our population's growing, but what its structure is like, and its age structure in particular. So this is a view of the Australian population 25 years ago in 1991. And you can see there's some fairly big age groups for the young adults here. So basically how you read this, such an age-sex pyramid, is age groups are down the middle there, females are on the right, males are on the left, and the length of each of the bars represents the proportion of the entire population that is in that particular age group or sex. So if you have a look at that pyramid there, you'll see in 1991 the largest age cohort there was 30 to 34. And you can see that really the big groups were probably from 15 to 19 up to 40 to 44. So let's have a look what our population looks like 25 years later. Now, these are proportions, it's not numbers, but it just shows you the relativity in the age structure. And what you'll see is that proportionally there are much fewer younger people in 2016 and proportionally more older people. So you will all have heard about the ageing of the population, and this is what it's about. It's where the bulk of the population is sitting or moving to. And there's been some significant growth up in these the baby boomer age groups. But also, if you have a look at 85 and over, they're only small bars, but the size of the increase is pretty big from what it was. So in 2016, 16% of Australia's population was 65 and over. And there are almost 500,000 people in Australia aged 85 and over. South Australia has one of the largest populations aged 85 and over in terms of its proportion. And I'll just compare here what the Australia age-sex structure in blue looks like compared to South Australia's in the orange. So you can see the points of difference are around from, say, the ages of particularly 25, 29, up to 35 to 39. Proportionally, South Australia has a lot fewer people in those age groups. That's partly because of people leaving the state to go elsewhere for education and employment opportunities. And you can see that once you get over the age of 50, that's where South Australia has proportionally more people in each of those older age groups than does Australia as a whole.
Sue?
Yes?
Can we take a photograph of that or something like that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, you can take photographs, but what we'll also be doing, if you've left your contact details with us, we'll be emailing the presentation out. So this is what all the treasuries are aware of. Because this is what you need to be planning for. And, you know, was it Peter Costello, how many years ago, said demography is destiny? And you can just see it as it, you know, moves through these age-sex pyramids. So the other thing that the census is really useful for is once every 5 years giving us a stock take of how many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people there are within Australia. And in 2016, we counted 649,171. That's a growth of about 18% since 2011. So if you think the Australian population as a whole has grown by 8.8% over that period, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population has grown by more than twice that speed. A lot of the growth in that population has occurred in the southeastern states, particularly in New South Wales. Population grew by 25%, and also in Queensland, which has grown by 19%. In contrast, the Northern Territory population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders grew by 3%, and in WA it was around 9% as well. So in South Australia, there are approximately 34,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, representing 2% of South Australia's population. Sorry, wrong one. So this table here has two columns giving you two different views of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population in each state and territory. So the first numerical column on the left there shows you the distribution of that population across all states and territories. And what it shows you is that 33.3%, a third of the population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders lives within New South Wales, and 28.7% lives in Queensland. So those two states account for a large proportion of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. And that surprises a lot of people. In the NT's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population accounts for 9% of the entire country's population. Now, this view here in the second numeric column, though, gives you the concentration of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population in each state and territory. So what proportion of New South Wales population is made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Well, just 2.9%. But if you have a look at the Northern Territory, you can see that Aboriginal people make up just over a quarter of the territory's population. So the concentration is quite different from the distribution. And for Greater Adelaide, they make up 1.4% of the population of Greater Adelaide. And this is what the age structure of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people looks like compared to that of Australia as a whole, or the non-Indigenous population, which is very similar to Australia as a whole. So there's a few things you notice, and one is how young the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is. 53% of that population is aged under 25 years. And that compares to about a third of the non-Indigenous population. And just 5% are aged 65 and over, compared to 16% in the broader population. So we do have some summary measures to show how young or older population is, and that's the median age. The median age for Australia as a whole is now 38 years. For the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, it's 23 years. So we've got a few median ages in the audience. I can see a few people nodding. So there's still quite a big gap in the age group, in the median age of those different populations there. So our next section, we're going to look at cultural diversity within Australia, and we've got a few interesting insights there. So Valise will take us through that. Plug you in here. That one there.
I am quite terrible with microphones. Can people hear me? Can you hear me? Great. I really am quite terrible. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is how diverse Australia is. And we'll have a few slides about the migrant population as well. So, Australia is an incredibly diverse country, with over 180 countries represented in the 2016 census and over 300 different ancestries. Nearly half of our country's population was either born overseas or is a second-generation migrant whose parents were born overseas. with 28% of Australians being first-generation migrants, that makes Australia proportionally a country with a higher proportion of first-generation migrants than New Zealand, the United Kingdom, the United States, or Canada. So where do our first-generation Australians live? So much like the rest of the population, the majority live on the eastern seaboard, with about in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, which isn't surprising when we consider 80% of the entire population lives in those three states in the ACT. 83% live in capital cities. That compares to 61% of Australians who weren't born overseas who live in capital cities. In South Australia, we have a population of around 385,000 people who were born overseas. The majority of those do live in Adelaide, with around 340,000, which is 26% of the total population. When we look at overseas-born migrants over time, we see a very interesting picture. 50 years ago, in 1966, you can see up there, a third of the population was born in England, and only 1.6% came from India and China combined. 50 years later, the picture's quite different. So while the most common birthplace for those born overseas is still England, it's now only 15% of the total overseas-born population. There has been a significant increase in the population born in China and India, with 8.3% born in China, up from 6% in 2011, and 7.4% born in India, up from 5.6% in 2011. This trend becomes even more apparent when we look at the last 10 years. The last 10 years, we can see that the 5 countries that made up the most common source of Australia's first-generation migrants, most of them are outside of Europe. So we've got India, China, England, New Zealand, and the Philippines. This has led to the dramatic shift we see represented in that previous graph. So in 2000, Australia had more than twice as many overseas born people from Europe than they did from Asia. In 2016, to 15 years later, 20% more of a overseas-born population was born in Asia than Europe. So you can see there's been quite a dramatic shift there. And we can see that when we look at it over time. The proportion of overseas people from Europe has fallen from 52% in 2001 to 34% in 2016. Conversely, the proportion of migrants born in Asia has increased from 24% in 2001 to 40% in 2016. When we look at Adelaide, we see a pretty similar picture. We will be well when my graph changes. There we are. Although we see Philippines comes in to replace New Zealand. So if we look at Adelaide, of 132,265 recent arrivals since 2006, 16.4% were from India, 14.1% from China, 13% from England, 4.4% from the Philippines, and 3.1% from Vietnam. Here's my age-sex pyramid, and this one's a really interesting one. So what we can see here is 2 very different populations. When you look at the blue, these are the population of Australians who were born in Europe. When you look at the orange, these are the population of Australians born in Asia. And you can see with the recent migration, the population born in Asia is significantly younger than the population of Australians who were born in Europe. That's because the majority of European migration happened after the Second World War, and it's been tapering off ever since, where in recent years the majority of migration has come from Asian countries. Yep, go for it. See, I told you I was terrible at microphones. So that leaves us with our overseas population that was born in Asia, which has a median age of 35 years compared to the European-born overseas migrants, which has a much, much higher median age of 59 years. Okay?
Just want to make sure everyone can hear you.
Is that better?
Give it a go.
Is that better? All right, that sounds better. Now I feel like I'm actually talking into a microphone. All right, so let's have a look at Ancestry. So this is a different way of looking at Australia's population, because what it does is tells us a bit more about the people, the second generation and third and multiple generation migrants. Ancestry in the census is measured by how a person identifies with a cultural group. So you get some interesting responses in the Ancestry question as a result. In the 2016 census, European ancestries dominate the top 10, with 7 out of the top 10 being European, including a definition of Australian. So that isn't Australian Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander, it's a more European definition of Australian. We had 10 ancestries with over 5,000 responses more that doubled over the last 5 years. That was led by people identifying with the Chin ancestry, which increased 311% since 2011, the Punjabi ancestry, which increased 191%, and the Hazara ancestry, which increased 150%. When we look at South Australia and Adelaide, we see very similar to the top 5 ancestry sponsors from Australia. That's in that lovely tree graphic, with the exception of German, which is in the top 5 in both South Australia and Adelaide, but not in the rest of Australia. Language spoken at home. So this question on the census asks for people who speak a language other than English at home. When we look at the responses, we see a slightly different picture than we do in the Ancestry and country of birth responses, with 4 of the top 5 in Australia being Asian languages or Middle Eastern languages, with Arabic, Vietnamese, Cantonese and Mandarin. When we look at South Australia and Adelaide, we see a slightly different picture with the addition of Italian and Greek in that language picture. Of those, we also ask on the census those who speak a language other than English at home how well they speak English, which isn't a perfect measure of English proficiency, but it's a really interesting one. Of those who stated that they spoke a language other than English at home, 82.3% spoke English very well or well. 12.7% did not speak English well, and 3.9% did not speak English at all. 1.1% stated that they spoke a language other than English, but did not state their English proficiency. This means that about 3.5% of the Australian population, or 1 in 30, either don't speak English or don't speak it well. There's also some interesting stories when we look at our responses to our religion question over time. So you can see here in 1966, almost 90% of the population identified with a Christian religion, which is to be expected considering the predominantly European migration we had at the time. Over time, we've seen that fall to the 2016 number, which is 52.1% of the population identifying with a Christian religion. Offsetting this is a significant increase in the number of people who identify with the no religion, and that's gone up to just over 30% in 2016. When you break the religion responses down by age, we see an interesting picture. Young people are significantly more likely to report that they identify with no religions. with people aged 18 to 34 years, 39% were reported that they had no religion, and they were also more likely to be affiliated with religions other than Christianity, with 12% as opposed to the Australia figure of just over 8%. Older people, particularly those aged 65 years and over, were most likely to report that they identified with a Christian religion, 70%. If you look at this, you can also see the religion pattern for the people under 18 is quite similar to the pattern of those in that 35 to 49-year-old age group. What we think is happening here is people in that age group are filling out the form for their children. It happens. It's a long form. It's a bit hard to convince your kids that want to sit down and fill out the census form. So that's a bit of a picture of Australia's diversity, and that's a very broad picture. If you go, and it's very different when you go to different geographies. So that's quite high-level geographies: Australia, South Australia, Adelaide. Go look up your local suburb. You'll see a very different picture, and it's worth doing. And we'll tell you how to do that later on. But for now, Sue's going to talk about some of our household and family party stories.
That one. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Just going back to that diversity question a moment, we went to in Sydney to do a presentation a few weeks ago, and Sydney is sort of super diverse, and when you have a look, for example, at particular age groups, so the 30 to 34 year age group, 3/4 of people in Sydney in that age group are either born overseas or have at least one parent born overseas. So it's just phenomenal, the impact of migration in some of our capital cities and also on those prime working age groups. So as Elise said, go in and just have a look at your own area because they're all a bit different. So this next section, we'll have a look at the picture of families and households and living arrangements in Australia. And some of these things tend to change slowly over time. Some aspects of it change pretty quickly though. So this slide here just shows you a broad breakdown of families in Australia in 2016. And you can see 44.7% were couples with children. That compares to 54% 25 years ago. So there's proportionally fewer couples with children now in Australia. In 2016, almost 38% were couples without children. Now, that isn't just that everybody's decided not to have kids. There's also empty nesters in there, as well as younger people. So that was almost 38% in 2016. That's up from 32% in 1991. And single-parent families make almost 16% of Australia's families now, and that compares to 13% back in 1991. So a bit of a change over 25 years. And you'll see that for single-parent families, lone parent families, women still make up the vast majority of people who head up those families there. Something that we've seen an enormous change in, though, in the last 5 years is the number of same-sex couples, and of course that's all very topical at the moment. In 2016, there were 46,800 same-sex couples identified in the census, and that's a growth of 39% in the last 5 years. So that's a really big figure there. And there's always been slightly more male same-sex couples than female. The interesting thing in looking at the two different types of families there is that female same-sex couples are about 5 times more likely than men to have children living within that household. So, what do we see across the states and territories? Well, this shows you a picture of how things vary between states and territories and how things have changed over time. And this graph here is showing that how the proportion of all couples that are actually same-sex couples, and at the Australia level it's about 1%. So 1% of all Australia's couples are same-sex couples, but you'll see that in the ACT, for example, proportionally that's quite a bit higher at about 1.4%, and South Australia and Western Australia are sort of relatively low compared to the rest of the country. One of the things that we can identify in the census as well is just how many people are living alone. And in Australia in 2016, 2 million people were living alone in Australia. That's up from 1.9 million in 2011. And a lot of that's to do with the ageing of the population, because it's a phenomenon that is associated with age. So if you have a look at that graph there, there's probably 2 bits to look at. One is probably from 25 to 29 and the other up to about 70, and then there's the post-70 picture. And when we have a look at the marital status of people from, say, 29 to 70, the most common marital status for people living alone is that they are divorced or separated. But once you actually start looking at 70, 75 onwards, the most common marital status of these people is they're widowed. So there's lots of different things happening at different ages to explain these patterns here. And this graph here is showing you the proportion of people in each age group who are living alone. So you can see that the peak age group there for women is about 85 to 89, and about 40% of women in that age group are living alone in 2016. The other thing that is very much associated with age as well is need for assistance. And on the census, we can identify the number of people who need assistance with a core activity. Now, a core activity is something like showering, dressing, that kind of thing. We tend to pick up people who've got severe or profound disabilities through this kind of measure. And you can see that there's very low rates of needs for assistance throughout the life course until you start getting into the older age groups. So it really starts to kick up from probably about the age of 75. And overall in Australia, there were 1.2 million Australians who identified a need for assistance in 2016. And the peak age group here is, I guess, once you start getting over 85 and over. And there, you're talking about the vast majority of people in those age groups needing some assistance. So who provides the care to people who need assistance? Well, this information in this graph gives you the age and sex distribution of people who've provided unpaid care to somebody who needed assistance because of a disability, old age, or a long-term health condition. So it's not looking after children or anything. This is about somebody who needs assistance. And you can see there that at most age groups, there are proportionally more women than men providing assistance. But for both sexes, there's some quite clear peaks. And it's interesting that some of those peaks are occurring throughout what we would call working age groups as well. And so it will be interesting to have a look at once the labour force information comes out from the census in October. For these people who are providing care in the working age groups, are they also working, are they juggling full-time and part-time care work as well? This is a graph which is probably the grandparents' graph, and it indicates how many people of a particular age and sex have provided care for children other than their own during the 2 weeks prior to the census. And there's some clear peaks there as well, really from probably 55 to 74 or so. And you can see that for women aged 60 to 69, almost a quarter of those had looked after somebody else's child in the 2 weeks prior to the census. And granddads aged 65 to 69 have also, 16% of those had done that too. And this is always something that provokes a few wry grins or otherwise as we look at this, and this is for males and females looking at what proportion did no hours of domestic work or some, and then how much it was. It sort of beggars belief that you could have such a high proportion of people doing nothing, whether male or female. I don't know how you actually get away with doing that, but probably about 22% of males and 15% of females do no hours of work. I have my own theories about if you look at that by age, it would be fairly telling, but that's all I'm saying. You can see that for 5 to 14 hours, it's a pretty similar picture, but generally females are doing more and males are doing less. Of course, again, you probably need to have a look at that in terms of employment as well.
Do you think that some of this could depend on whether it was a male or a female filling out the form?
What you trying to say? Well, I filled out my bit. My husband filled out his, and I didn't check what he'd put, though he might have checked what I put. No, it's just really interesting, and it's one of those items that sort of stands on its own, and you can make what you like of it. But it's really a lot of families. They fit in all sorts of things. So they might be fitting in caring for somebody else. They might be fitting in caring for children, and often juggling a mixture of full and part-time work. So to me, it's only when you put all those things together you can see who's doing what. But it's that first category there. I still don't know how anybody can not do anything. But anyway, okay. So this last section here that we're going to look at is just going to give you some insight into what the census can tell you about economic well-being in Australia. And we're going to look at a few things here. One, the first thing we're going to look at is income and how that varies. And then we're going to have a look at housing costs, mortgage costs and rental costs. And then we're going to relate those to income and see what kind of picture that gives us for Australians' economic well-being. So, we actually produce a number of measures of income. So this is median personal income. So median is just the midpoint. You'll know plenty of people who earn way above that, and there's obviously a lot of people who earn below that figure, but it's just the midpoint figure. It's a sort of an average. So in 2016, the median personal income was $662 a week for the Australia level. Of course, we also have family income and household income as well. So let's have a look at who's earning a lot of money. And in the ACT, it's clearly much higher than anywhere else, $998 a week. All I'll say is I live across the border in New South Wales, unlike my colleagues who've come over with me yesterday. But it's closely followed by NT and WA, so two of the mining states and territories. South Australia's median personal income is lower, quite a bit lower than the national figure, and Tasmania's is lower again at $573. Now, personal income isn't just wages and salaries, it's also pensions, benefits, superannuation. And one of the things that we know about both South Australia and Tasmania is that you have an older population, so proportionally you've got more retired people in these two states. That's part of the story, it's not the whole story. So Tasmania's employment profile looks different again, pays different wages, etc., etc. So there's quite a difference across the states and territories. And then what we see is that people living in the capital cities tend to have more income than do people outside the capital cities as well. So that's the figure for Greater Adelaide at 617. So let's get on to some of the housing costs and then see how income fits in with all this. So housing and the cost of housing is something that's very topical. In fact, it's been topical for as long as I've been in Australia. And this shows you the median mortgage repayments in the capital cities and for Australia in 2016. And again, this is a median figure and it's in dollars per month. So the figure for Australia is 1,755. That's the median mortgage repayment across Australia. Darwin has the highest at 2,200, closely followed by Sydney, 2,167. Adelaide is considerably lower at 1,517. Hobart is the lowest, 1,402. So quite a bit of variation there between the various capital cities in terms of housing costs. So now we're adding income into the mix. And the income that we're adding here is household income. And these points on the graph in the green box show you for each capital city and for Australia what proportion of households in that capital city are paying more than 30% of their monthly income on the mortgage. And Perth stands out there as having the highest proportion of households, 9.2%, paying more than 30% of their monthly income on the mortgage. Hobart is probably the lowest there, 5.3%. Adelaide is 7%. So Perth really stands out as really quite high there. Interestingly enough, this is often called mortgage stress, and mortgage stress has actually gone down since 2011. And one of the reasons for that is interest rates have gone down. So of course, if interest rates go up, then you'll see a different picture again. So let's have a look. Australia there, it's roughly about 7% of Australian households experiencing mortgage stress. So bear that thought in mind when we go on and have a look at rental stress, because it's a bit of a different picture again. So this shows you the median rental costs in dollars per week across the capital cities and Australia. And there are only two capital cities where the median rental costs are more than $400 a week, and that's Darwin at $420 and Sydney $440. The Australia picture is about $335. Adelaide is $285, and Hobart has the lowest median rent of all at $260. So let's throw income into the mix. And this is similar to the previous graph, which is showing you the proportion of households paying more than 30% of their income on rent. And you can see that at the Australia level, there's 11.5% of all households in rental stress. So it's a higher level in rental stress than in mortgage stress. So if you have a look at Sydney, you can see Sydney stands out there, 14.2% of households paying more than 30% of their income on the mortgage, the rent, sorry. And you can see that Adelaide and Hobart stand out there as well. Even though rents are relatively low, incomes are low. And so that's why you can see that there's quite a high proportion there experiencing rental stress. Brisbane's pretty high as well. So for Sydney, it's 14.2% experiencing rental stress. It's 8.4% experiencing mortgage stress. So it's about 22% of households in Sydney are experiencing one form of housing stress as much as the other, which is quite a considerable size. We went to UTS in Sydney and gave a presentation, and we had a look at Haymarket, which is just by UTS. Now, there are a lot of students in those suburbs, and you'd expect students to have pretty low incomes, so rent would take a big whack of that. But it was 47% of households in Haymarket had rental stress. And what you see when you're looking at the rental picture and the mortgage picture, you'll see it's often a tale of two cities in one city. And the rental stress is occurring around the city centres, and the mortgage stress is occurring in the mortgage belts on the outside, where people are often buying a house for the first time and mortgaging to the max. So if you graph this information, it's really illuminating as well. So that's the end of... Sorry.
Housing cost information.
Yep.
How soon
Sorry.
will you release information on the age grouping breakdown?
Sorry?
I was wondering with the housing cost information, how soon will you be releasing breakdowns in the age group?
That information's there already to be extracted, so that information is there.
For state?
Yeah, it's all there. So that's the end of the data presentation, and I'll hand back over to Valise now, and she'll show you where to go to get all this fabulous information. And then after that, we'll take some additional questions as well.
I'll just use this one to start with, I think. All right, so you all want to rush home and look up all this exciting data, right? Yes, of course, that's the correct answer. How do you do it? So the ABS offers a range of census data products aimed at a variety of usages, from our more accessible basic statistical product like QuickStats to Table Builder Basic and Pro, where you can pull out pretty much any table you can dream of. To access the products, it's quite straightforward. This is the Census website, this ABS website rather. I suppose it's the same thing. abs.gov.au. When you get to the home page, you'll see the bar up the top and Census. It's not surrounded by a big red oval though on the website, so don't look for the oval, look for the Census word. Once you click on that, you come to our Census splash page. So you can see we have a range of different links here. When you're looking for data products, the column you're most interested in is the data by products in the middle. And that'll take you to all our main products. However, there's some other interesting information you can access from here, including our Understanding Census Data publication, which has a lot of quality information on the different topics, including how they're processed, item non-response rates, to help you on the Census Dictionary, which breaks down the classifications that are used within the census, and you can also access our historical census data through that far right Understanding the Census Data column as well, so you can go back and look at previous censuses. Now, going into some of our products in a bit more detail, we have our analytical products. So these are very accessible articles, short pictures of high-level geographies. So we have some great articles on religion, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and I have a list. Cultural diversity and sex and gender diversity in the 2016 census, as well as some fabulous infographics showing at the state and territory and Australia level. We're planning on adding to this part of the website over the next 6 to 9 months. So we have some articles planned on family characteristics, journey to work, rural living and apartment living, and a few more I'm sure our people back at the ABS are busily dreaming up. Then we have our Quick Stats product. This is my favourite product because it's the one where I can just go in and pull out the one thing I need without having to do anything too complicated. So when you get to Quick Stats, it gives you some basic key tables on people, family, dwellings and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So you can see a nice breakdown there of, in the top, as a summary of people, ages, sex, families and dwelling characteristics, including income. This is available at a lot of different geographies. When you are looking at Quick Stats, just make sure you've got the right geography, because as Sue mentioned at the start, if you typed in Adelaide, you get a lot would come up. So you want to make sure you're looking, if you want data on Adelaide, the greater capital city, you want to make sure you're not looking at Adelaide, the city centre, because you'll get very, very different numbers, and a few people have done it and published it and it's not been good. So check the map. Community profiles give a bit more information than Quick Stats. So Quick Stats I think is about 20 tables, whereas each of the community profiles is about 30 to 40 tables, depending on which one you're looking at. We've done some rationalisation in this space since 2011, so it should be easier to find what you're looking for. So we've got 3 community profiles. Our general community profile, which contains general population information about the area, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's profile, and our time series profile, and that one compares data from 2016, 2011 and 2006, so over the last 3 censuses. Then we have Table Builder. Now Table Builder is fantastic because it lets you design your own table. So if you are interested in things like age breakdown of rental stress, this is the place to look at that information. So you can design pretty much anything you can think of in Table Builder. We offer Table Builder a couple of different ways. So there's 2 free versions. So we have Table Builder Guest. Now that's if you just want to get in there, you don't want to log in, you can run basic tables up to 10,000 cells. Then we have Table Builder Basic, which is also free. You do need to register, but it lets you save tables for later. You can run bigger tables, so over 10,000 cells. And then we have our bells and whistles product, which is our Table Builder Pro offering, which has significantly more detailed information available. And for 2016 in Table Builder Pro, we've added for the first time mesh block level information. So for people that deal in custom geographies, that's a great advantage to them because they can build their own geographies from the mesh block data. Table Builder also lets you produce maps, graphs, and varying custom recodes of our data items as well, which is great. I love the graphs. You can go in there, you can change the colours, you can have pie charts. We don't really like pie charts at the ABS, but we have them in Table Builder and they're fantastic. Then we have our data packs. So data packs in 2011 required registration. They were free, but they required you to register. In 2016, you no longer have to register, so they're more accessible. And this is our data pack page. So you can see, you pick your census year, you pick what type of data pack you want and the geography you want it in. So data packs are predefined static tables, but they contain an awful lot of information about that area, and they're great if you want a really comprehensive picture. Most of our users of data packs take the data and load it into their own systems, but they're worth a look regardless. So on June 27th, we put out a lot of census data. We followed it in July with our Table Builder and Data Packs releases. There's still plenty to come though, so in October we're going to release employment qualifications and population mobility topics in Quick Stats community profiles and data packs, and Table Builder I think is actually coming in November, but I'd have to get that clarified. Then from December 2017, we produce some more complicated products based on census data, and that includes our CIFA profiles, our census microdata, so our and the Australian Census longitudinal data set, as well as the estimates of homelessness. And that is start being released from December